Uh, I'd like to introduce Dr. Russell Sanders. I'm stuttering over that. Rusty has been a friend of mine for a very long time, and he is an expert at training leaders, both managers and supervisors, in a number of areas, including conflict management. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about communicating in the face of conflict. So I think we'll start off with a question of what's the biggest impediment for communicating when faced with conflict?
Well, that's a good question. I suppose I would say that the biggest impediment in communicating in the face of conflict is when a person wants to prove themselves right no matter what.
So ego.
Bingo. Yeah. So getting yourself out of the way and beginning to engage the other person and pay a close attention and listen carefully to what they're saying is part of the beginning of resolving some conflict.
Mm-hmm. So how important is it to be able to listen? And the reason I say that is oftentimes with our egos, we don't want to listen. We want to start preparing for our next response to the argument.
Sure. We're constantly rehearsing about, what we're going to do next and what should happen and so on and so forth. But letting go of that is part of the process of dealing successfully with conflict. I don't know, Roger, have you ever had experience with people in conflict when you do your work?
It's always some kind of conflict somewhere in the world. And this is why this is such a great topic today, because everywhere you turn in the world, there's conflict. And whether it's political or personal or business-wise, just conflict is everywhere. And that's why communication, as you just described, is so important, and why listening and making the other person feel like they have been heard is got to be key in this whole process, I would think.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right about that. And the conflict that we experience all over the place, all over the planet today, it's like there is so much stress in cultures that the stress actually feeds into the maintenance of conflict. The more stressed I am, the more anxious I am, the more I want to get my point across and prove myself to be right. And yet that's contrary to what needs to happen. I need to kind of get myself out of the way and really pay attention and focus on the other person. And as you said, Roger, help them to feel like they've been heard and understood. Because that reduces the tension and that reduces the stress just a tiny bit.
And it seems like if you get them to generate their data, it's more believable to them rather than you trying to impose your data or ideas upon them. So if they have their own ideas and you can get them to speak to those, then that has to be, I guess, a starting point, I would think.
I think that is a starting point, because what that leads to is that you help them begin to identify what they value and what they believe in, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the things that you might want to do when you are listening to them very carefully, you may want to engage them in raising some questions about how consistent they are between their ideas and their actions. And then you begin to help them identify some of the cognitive dissonance that's actually present in the system. That's going to happen all the time, and it happens everywhere.
Well, Rusty, you just used a phrase that many people aren't going to really recognize, and that's cognitive dissonance. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we often have our belief system. We might think we're a legend in our own mind, so to speak, that we're wonderful in everything we do. And when we get feedback that is contrary to our belief system, that creates a cognitive dissonance. In other words, now we have two ideas going on in our mind, one that we firmly believe in and one that we disagree with. And that dissonance then creates that stress you're talking about, and it makes it difficult for people to be logical and to step back from the emotion of the moment and be able to deal with what's going on.
Well, I think you're right about that, Steve. Cognitive dissonance actually is very stressful. And that's when there's a realization that my beliefs and my actions are they're inconsistent. So, for example, I might preach about the dangers of cigarette smoking, and yet I need to take a smoke break after I've talked about it.
You're right.
That's a clear contradiction. Saying smoking is bad for you and I go ahead and smoke. Well, those two things don't fit together. And when I explore my values, if I can help somebody explore their values and then begin to gently raise questions about, so how is that consistent with, for example, what you're doing? Then get them to begin to think about it, and they begin to identify their own dissonance. And they actually then can change their belief or accept a decision that I'm proposing for them. So for example, let's take for an example, a supervisor is talking to an employee. The employee believes that they are just faultless and they're just doing fine. But the supervisor points out to them that their actions are not helping the company. So one of the things that when the conflict gets going, one of the things the supervisor can do is begin to say, so what is one of your values about working for the company? And the employee is likely to say, well, I want to support the company because it supports me. Well, that's good. And I'm really pleased to hear that that's a value of yours. How then does your behavior in X situation, this situation, or that situation, how does that match up with your values about supporting the company? And then get them to begin to reflect on their own behavior and how that behavior matches up with their values. And that begins to help kind of ease a little bit of the stress, because they always feel like they're being heard when they're being listened to very carefully by the supervisor.
So in conflict, asking questions that elicit a thoughtful process is helpful. So for instance, when someone is angry with you and they make a statement, to say, that's interesting. How did you come to that conclusion? Or that's interesting. What brought that on?
Or it may not be interesting. It may just be perceived as an attack.
Yeah.
So when somebody is attacking me, it's like, wait a minute. Help me out here. What brought that on?
Right.
And, rather than saying that's interesting, because it may not be, just to simply say, wait, hold it just a second. I'm feeling kind of like you're coming at me pretty strong. What brings that on for you? What did I do?
Yeah.
Help me out. Help me understand.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get to talk and you get to listen. And you set aside your own little protective mechanism, because there's a chance that there's always a tendency on each of our parts to say, well, I'm the right one. I've got it right. I know I've got it right. If you just listen to me, then, we would get along just fine. And that's the way people are communicating these days in this pandemic. Just if you want to talk about conflict, look at the vaccinators and the anti-vaccinators. Whoa, what a conflict that is.
Mm-hmm.
That's going on all the time. And people just they actually have a difficult time sitting there listening to each other.
We have heard the old saying that seek first to be understand,
right,
and then seek to be understood.
Right.
And that has to be the mindset a little bit to really resolving conflict.
Seek first to understand, then you can be understood. Yeah, I love that,
right.
Roger. Yeah. That's good.
So, Rusty, you talked to me about 4 aspects of working through conflict, if you will, and they were engagement, listening, trust, and potential solutions. Are those in order, or are they just 4 things that need to be taking place simultaneously?
Well, I think maybe they're in order. First of all, there's the engagement, just so that we're gonna engage one another. Then listening very, very carefully. What was the third one?
Trust.
Aha, yeah. It's that listening very carefully that begins to build a sense of trust that I may actually care about what you have to say.
Mm-hmm.
And when that becomes real and becomes apparent, when you're convinced that when you become convinced that I'm being honest with you and that I'm really concerned and listening to you carefully, that begins to build a sense of trust in the relationship. And I think the trust in the relationship begins to be the key to conflict resolution.
Mm-hmm.
I see this I've done a lot of family businesses where you have family members who are also engaged in the process of doing business together. Sometimes they get into some conflict and lack of understanding, et cetera, et cetera. And I get called in sometimes to help them sort things out. Part of my process then is to help them, engage them, listen to them, help them begin to build a sense of trust that our relationship really counts, and then we can begin to explore solutions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that cover what we talked about?
Well, yeah, that's interesting, because I think that one of the things I'm seeing with a lot of my work in doing 360 assessment of leaders is that there's 2 areas that they struggle with almost consistently. One is conflict management, and one is holding themselves and others accountable. Themselves accountable in the context that they're holding others accountable. And because this issue of conflict and holding people accountable, they're so much afraid of it. There's such fear that they're going to mess up a relationship, or that the person's going to leave the organization if they don't like what they're hearing. And I think that it's a gift and to sit down with someone and say, we've got a problem. I need your help in working it out. It doesn't have to be full frontal conflict.
No.
But we got a problem. we need to work it out. I need your help in working it out. And here's what I'm seeing. Help me figure out a way to fix this. The other thing that can help build trust in this is to say, we've got a problem, and I want you to be successful in this organization. We need you in this organization, and I want you to be successful. And I'm going to bring something up that's going to be probably difficult to work with, but my intentions are to help make this better and work through it that way, so that as you engage and you ask them what they think we can do to fix this, and you listen intently without trying to have a response to it, then you can start building that trust to get the solution you want. It's kind of interesting. I've listened to a couple of podcasts where it's obvious that the person who's kind of moderating this podcast is actually listening to the person without trying to think of a response. Because when that person's, the person they're interviewing says something, there's often a silence for 10, 15 seconds. And I'm wondering, did something happen on the podcast? And then he starts speaking. He asks another question, or he gives a response, and it's well thought out because it relates directly to what the person has said.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
there's a demonstration that listening is occurring.
Right. The fact that you're not instantly responding to somebody's thoughts leaves the impression that you're actually thinking about what they said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to be able to repeat back to that person what they said, maybe not word for word, but in your best impression of what they said, to be sure that you got it right, again, helps them understand that you're being thoughtful about what's coming out of this conversation.
Very good. You know, one of the things that I wanted to respond to was what you originally said, and that is there's so much fear in managers and supervisors about keeping people accountable. And what does that mean? And I think that's part of the intervention process, is to ask the executive or the manager or the supervisor, whoever you're talking to, what does it mean to hold somebody accountable? What does that mean to you? And I think it'd be kind of interesting to ask the two of you, Roger, you know, what does it mean to you to keep somebody accountable?
I'm not sure that I guess people can be held accountable by their supervisors, but I like to think that we could hold ourselves accountable. And when we hold ourselves accountable, it seems like it's more meaningful. It's our ideas, it's our data, it's our self, moving yourself forward. And when you do that, you have a tendency to benefit from it even greater, because when you hold yourself accountable, you have a greater sense of accomplishment, greater self-esteem, and you feel better about yourself.
Okay. How about you, Steve? What does it mean to you to be accountable, to hold people account?
I think it's a gift. Oftentimes we think of holding people accountable, which creates conflict in many cases.
Yeah, sure.
Holding people accountable is you're giving them a gift that helps them become more effective. And if you treat it in the context of giving someone a gift, then you're going to have minimal amount of conflict. But if you think of holding someone accountable from a perspective of discipline,
bingo,
you're missing out on a real opportunity to build a relationship, develop trust, and get the best you can out of an employee. To ignore an issue that needs to be addressed is always seen by all the people in the organization that are, sure, that may be on your team or whatever else have you. So when you deal with accountability or conflict, and you consider it a gift to be able to help someone become better, to help yourself become better, that's really important. And when a supervisor, when a team per se sees the leader saying, I'm going to hold you accountable because I want you to be successful and I want the team to be successful, the individuals then can say, okay, well, I'm going to hold myself accountable because I want to support the team.
There you go. Yeah.
And the peers can say, well, if I know that Steve is going to hold Rusty accountable. I see Rusty doing something. I can talk to Rusty about it because I know Steve is going to talk to him as well. And that peer self-leader triad, if you will, of building trust and holding people accountable actually helps minimize conflict. That is negative conflict. And I think you and I have talked about the fact that there's conflict that's negative and there's conflict that's positive. Yep. And when we have conflict that's where we're trying to work through ideas and we share each other's and we ideas and we our perspectives and what have you, it can help us to refine the ideas and the decisions that we're making. But when we're just being obstinate, ego-driven, and saying, no, this is stupid and whatever else have you, that kind of conflict can be very, very detrimental to an organization.
I agree. And so I think when you're working with, whether you're building a website, when you're helping somebody build a website, Roger, or Steve, when you're doing a 360 review or whatever, I think if you find out that a lot of people think of holding people to accountable is the ability to confront other people. Well, that's not a good definition of accountability. Holding people to account is, as I like what you just said about, it's a gift that you have to give to somebody else to maintain the organization, to continue to get quality performance out of everyone, including yourself. Then I think that's a stance that when you educate leaders and educate people who are building something, and then they can learn how to do it a little bit better. And I think, then they can engage each other. They can engage other people, give people feedback that's not confrontational, but simply informational. I think that's a really important issue as well.
Sure. Yeah, it just kind of brought to mind an issue as far as accountability is concerned. I remember years ago, I worked for an aircraft company, and I had an administrative assistant who was invited by someone that was not really authorized to take a ride down the flight line. And we had probably 10 airplanes. I mean, we're talking about big jumbo jet airplanes, and take, just a little joyride, if you will. And when I learned about it, I simply went up. She was sitting at her desk. I kneeled down by her desk and I said, listen, I used her name. I understand that this happened. And that's something that don't ever do again. People saw that and they're thinking, what's this person doing there? And, it's dangerous, and she could have caused, there could have been a problem. And there wasn't, but it was a matter of just very gently saying, don't do that again. And she said, oh, no problem. It wasn't defensive. Oh, you shouldn't, it was no problem.
That's excellent. And I'm going to underscore your word gently.
Yeah.
I like that term, because I think that's something that we need to take when we move into a conflict situation. Gentleness is something that I think is really important to hold ourselves to be as gentle as we can when we're talking with other people who are stressed out and upset.
Right. It doesn't mean that when we say gentle, it doesn't mean that you're going to use weasel words and mealy mouth type talk.
Nope.
You're going to be direct, but you're going to do it in a manner that builds trust, and that people really see the importance of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's about being cognizant of your own tone.
Right.
The tone that you set when you're talking with somebody.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Any thoughts, Roger?
Well, we're just about out of time today, and we want to thank Rusty for a great conversation that we've had on the subject of conflict. It's so fantastic to have you on our podcast today. How could people get in touch with you, Rusty, if they want to have extend the conversation further and talk to you about some of the things that you do?
Well, thank you, Roger. I appreciate that. I suppose I could give you my what is it, the Gmail address?
Okay.
I mean, that's something that I wouldn't mind putting out there. It's rs.rustysanders@gmail.com.
Okay. Very
And
good.
I'd be happy to be responsive to anybody that has a question. I'd be happy to get into a dialogue with anybody to be interesting. So, yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for inviting me into this podcast.
Well, if I could just finish off here with so what is your point summary? Trust is crucial. We need to be able to engage, listen to, build trust with, and help solve a problem with people. The 4 things we talked about. We need to set our egos aside and listen without trying to argue to get their points of view. We need to understand that there's cognitive dissonance that we have to deal with. If they believe one thing strongly, you're not going to change that thing by arguing against it. You're going to need them to talk about it and talk it through and maybe see some of the weaknesses of their thought process. And ask questions. Ask questions that draw them out, get them to talk, because those questions, as you listen to the responses, help build trust. And those are key aspects of getting through conflict.
Very good, guys.
So thank you, everybody, for being with us today on So What Is Your Point? And our special guest, Rusty Sanders. And we will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.
Take care.